Early 1944, northern France. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt weighed 7 tons, fully loaded the heaviest single-engine fighter in the sky. Every tactical manual, every briefing, every training session had drilled the same doctrine into American pilots. Escort the bombers, stay high, protect the formations, don't get fancy. But below the scattered clouds, German locomotives churned black smoke across the French countryside, moving 20,000 tons of supplies every single day toward the Atlantic Wall. Traditional high-altitude bombing wasn't working. The trains kept running, and D-Day was coming. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics were brutal. Intelligence photos showed 37 trains crossing the Loire Valley in a single 24-hour period. Each locomotive pulled 15 to 18 cars, ammunition, fuel, concrete, steel, everything the Germans needed to turn Normandy's beaches into graveyards. The 8th Air Force had dropped 400 tons of bombs on rail yards the previous month. Result? The Germans had them operational again in 72 hours. At RAF Bottisham in eastern England, pilots of the 361st Fighter Group studied those same intelligence photos in early January 1944. They had just arrived in theatre, the last P-47 unit to join the 8th Air Force. Their Thunderbolts sat outside in the British winter, massive radial engines silent, waiting for a mission that made sense. The P-47 wasn't built for what was about to happen. Republic Aviation had designed it around the Pratt & Whitney R2800, double Wasp engine 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 banks, producing 2,000 horsepower. The result was an aircraft that could climb to 40,000 feet, absorb punishment that would shred other fighters, and deliver devastating firepower through 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns. But it was also an aircraft that weighed as much as a medium bomber when fully loaded. Pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and the nickname captured both its strength and its limitations. The Thunderbolt could escort B-17s deep into Germany. It could dogfight German interceptors at altitude. What it supposedly couldn't do was dive bomb moving targets at 400 miles per hour. The tactical thinking was straightforward. Fighter planes stayed high. Bombers attacked ground targets from 20,000 feet using precision bombing techniques. The system was clean, organized, and utterly failing to stop German supply trains from reinforcing the Atlantic Wall. By mid-January 1944, the strategic situation had become desperate. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, was scheduled for late spring. Every day the Allies delayed, gave the Germans another 24 hours to move steel and concrete to the beaches. Every locomotive that reached the coast meant more obstacles for landing craft, more machine gun bunkers overlooking the sand, more artillery positions zeroed in on approach routes. The traditional solution would have been to increase the bombing campaign against rail infrastructure. More aircraft, more sorties, more tonnage dropped on marshalling yards and junction points. But German repair crews had proven remarkably efficient at clearing damaged tracks. A bombing raid that cratered a rail yard might disrupt operations for a day or two before trains were running again. The real problem wasn't the stationary infrastructure, it was the moving locomotives themselves. A German freight locomotive in 1944 was a massive piece of industrial machinery. The standard models weighed over 200 tons when loaded with coal and water. They burned low-grade coal that produced distinctive black smoke, plumes visible for miles. Most importantly, they were vulnerable in ways that rail yards weren't. Destroy a locomotive, and you didn't just stop one train, you blocked the entire line behind it. The challenge was hitting them. A train travelling at 60 miles per hour covered nearly 90 feet per second. From 20,000 feet, even the most skilled bombardier would struggle to land bombs close enough to matter. The locomotive would see the aircraft coming, the engineer would open the throttle, and by the time bombs fell through 4 miles of air, the train would be hundreds of yards away from the impact point. What was needed wasn't precision from altitude, it was precision from speed and surprise. What was needed was someone willing to take a 7-ton fighter designed for high-altitude combat and turn it into a dive bomber. The concept violated everything in the tactical playbook. Fighter aircraft performed fighter missions, air-to-air combat, bomber escort, reconnaissance. Ground attack was for dedicated bomber aircraft with trained bombardiers and proper equipment. The idea of a single pilot diving a P-47 at terminal velocity to attack a moving train sounded less like tactics and more like suicide. But the mathematics suggested it might work. A Thunderbolt in a 60-degree dive could reach 400 miles per hour before the pilot pulled out. At that speed and angle, the time from initial approach to bomb release would be measured in seconds, far too fast for ground gunners to track and engage effectively. The aircraft's 8 machine guns could deliver 6,000 rounds per minute of combined fire, enough to shred railroad cars and detonate ammunition or fuel inside. The P-47's rugged construction made it uniquely suited for this kind of abuse. Its air-cooled radial engine could absorb damage that would down liquid-cooled designs. Its thick armor plating protected the pilot from ground fire. Most importantly, its massive weight, the very characteristic that made it less maneuverable than German fighters, gave it tremendous diving speed that could be converted into a nearly unstoppable attack run. The tactical doctrine began to take shape through careful analysis of German railway operations. Intelligence from French resistance networks provided detailed information about train schedules, routes, and defensive measures. Most German supply convoys ran during daylight hours because nighttime operations were too vulnerable to partisan sabotage. The locomotives followed predictable routes along major rail lines that couldn't be easily relocated. German defensive measures focused primarily on protecting against high-altitude bombing. Flak guns were positioned around marshalling yards and major rail junctions, their crews trained to engage aircraft at 15 to 20,000 feet. The guns themselves, mostly 88mm and 105mm weapons, required several seconds to traverse and elevate onto target. They were devastating against level-flying bombers, but potentially ineffective against diving fighters that appeared suddenly and pulled out before gunners could adjust their aim. The question was whether American pilots could master a completely new form of aerial combat in time to make a difference before D-Day. Training would have to happen quickly. The 361st Fighter Group had arrived in England in late November 1943, but they wouldn't fly their first combat mission until January 21, 1944. That gave them roughly 2 months to develop, test, and perfect tactics that no one had attempted before with the P-47. The aircraft itself would need modifications. Standard P-47 loadouts included provisions for bombs, but the specific combination of weapons for train busting required careful thought. The primary weapon would be 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs mounted on wing pylons. These would target the locomotive directly, with fuses set for instantaneous detonation to maximize damage against the massive boilers and fireboxes that powered the engines. The 850 caliber machine guns would handle everything else. Loaded with a mixture of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, they could penetrate railroad car walls and ignite whatever cargo lay inside. A train carrying ammunition would explode spectacularly. A fuel transport would create a fireball. Even supply cars filled with concrete and steel would be rendered useless, blocking the tracks and preventing other trains from passing. The bombing technique itself required split-second timing. A pilot diving at 60 degrees would watch his altimeter spin downward. 8,000 feet, 6,000, 4,000. At 2,000 feet, roughly 15 seconds from impact with the ground, he would release his bombs and immediately pull back on the control stick with both hands. The G-forces, during pullout, could reach 6 Gs, enough to cause temporary blackouts in pilots who weren't properly conditioned. Missing the timing meant either dropping bombs too early and missing the target entirely, or waiting too long and flying into your own blast radius. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. The physical demands on pilots were equally brutal. Pulling out of a steep dive at maximum airspeed subjected the human body to forces that caused blood to pool in the lower extremities, starving the brain of oxygen. Pilots had to learn breathing techniques and muscle tensioning exercises to maintain consciousness during the critical pull-out phase. Even with proper technique, vision would narrow to a tunnel, hearing would fade, and for a few seconds, pilots operated purely on training and instinct. German flak batteries represented the most immediate danger. Intelligence photographs showed rapid-firing 20mm and 37mm guns, positioned along major supply routes, specifically to counter low-flying aircraft. Unlike the heavy flak guns designed for altitude, these weapons could traverse quickly enough to engage diving fighters. A single hit to the engine or cockpit could prove fatal. The tactical solution was speed and surprise. A P-47, approaching from 12,000 feet, would be nearly invisible from the ground until it began its dive. The distinctive sound of the aircraft, a buzzsaw shriek created when the propeller tips approached the sound barrier, would announce its presence, but by then it would be too late for ground crews to react effectively. From initial detection to bomb impact would take less than 30 seconds. But theory was one thing, combat was another. Everything depended on whether American pilots could translate training into results when German gunners were shooting back with live ammunition. The strategic stakes couldn't be higher. D-Day was approaching. Every supply train that reached the coast made the invasion more costly. The difference between success and failure might come down to whether fighter pilots could master a completely new form of warfare in time to sever Germany's supply lines when it mattered most. The P-47 Thunderbolt was about to prove that sometimes the most unlikely aircraft could accomplish the impossible if someone was willing to ignore the rulebook and try something completely different. January 21, 1944. RAF Bottisham, England. The 361st Fighter Group flew its first combat mission with 36 P-47s. The primary objective was bomber escort, the standard mission profile that every fighter pilot had trained for. But as they returned from escorting B-17s over France, several pilots reported seeing German locomotives moving below the clouds, pulling supply trains toward the Channel coast. The sightings triggered conversations that had been building since the unit arrived in England. Pilots who had studied the intelligence photos knew what those trains represented. They understood the strategic importance of disrupting German logistics before the invasion. Most importantly, they understood that conventional high-altitude bombing wasn't stopping the trains. By early February, the idea had moved from informal discussion to serious tactical planning. The challenge was convincing command that fighter pilots could successfully attack trains using dive bombing techniques that hadn't been tested in combat with the P-47. The breakthrough came through systematic development of procedures. Pilots began practicing against decommissioned locomotives on British sidings, learning the precise timing required for effective attacks. They discovered that the key was maintaining a 60-degree or steeper dive angle until reaching 2,000 feet altitude. Any shallower and German gunners would have time to track and engage. Any lower and the pull-out forces became dangerous. The tactical approach evolved through trial and error. Initial attempts focused on single aircraft attacks, but pilots quickly realized that coordinated strikes by multiple aircraft were far more effective. A four-plane flight could approach from different angles, creating overlapping fields of fire that made evasion impossible for the train crew. One aircraft would target the locomotive with bombs, while the others strafed the length of the train with machine gun fire. Ammunition selection proved critical. Armor-piercing rounds could penetrate railroad car walls, but often passed straight through without causing significant damage. Incendiary rounds would ignite flammable cargo, but were less effective against ammunition or steel. The solution was a mixture of both types, loaded in a pattern that alternated between armor-piercing and incendiary every few rounds. This combination could both penetrate and ignite, maximizing damage against whatever cargo the train carried. The first combat test came in late March. Intelligence reported a high-priority German convoy moving through the Loire Valley, 12 cars pulled by a massive freight locomotive carrying ammunition bound for coastal defense positions. 4 P-47s, from the 360, first requested permission for what they called a training mission with live targets. The attack demonstrated both the potential and the risks of the new tactics. The lead pilot dove from 12,000 feet, releasing his bombs at 2,000 and scoring a direct hit on the locomotive. The massive boiler exploded, sending steam and metal fragments cascading across the tracks. The following 3 pilots walked machine gun fire down the length of the train, their armor-piercing and incendiary rounds punching through railroad car walls and igniting the ammunition inside. The entire attack lasted less than 45 seconds. When the pilots pulled up and reformed at altitude, 12 cars of German ammunition lay scattered across a quarter-mile of track. The rail line was blocked for 18 hours while repair crews cleared the wreckage. More importantly, they had proven the tactic worked against defended targets. German flak positions had opened fire when the Thunderbolts began their dive, but the guns couldn't depress and track fast enough to hit aircraft coming down at such steep angles and high speeds. The pilots had been in range of ground fire for less than 20 seconds, not enough time for effective engagement. The success triggered immediate interest from higher command. If 4 aircraft could destroy one train, what could larger formations accomplish? How many locomotives could be hit in a single day if operations were properly coordinated? The answer came on April 15, 1944, a date that would prove the concept on a scale that shocked even the planners. The mission was ambitious: 12 flights of 4 aircraft each, 48 Thunderbolts hitting every major supply route between Paris and the Channel coast. The operational window was 6 hours from first light to noon before German fighters could organize effective intercepts. The intelligence preparation was unprecedented in its detail. French resistance networks had provided exact schedules for German supply trains, down to departure times and cargo manifests. Reconnaissance flights had photographed every major rail line, identifying choke points where trains would be most vulnerable. Each 4-plane flight received specific railway corridors to patrol, with assigned sectors to prevent multiple flights from attacking the same targets. The first launches began at 5:30 in the morning. 48 Thunderbolts roared down the runway at RAF Bottisham and banked southeast toward France, followed at 10-minute intervals by formations from other bases. Radio silence was mandatory until after the first attacks. German listening posts could triangulate Allied formations and warn supply convoys to seek cover. Flying at 12,000 feet, the P-47s were invisible from the ground, just another group of aircraft heading toward Germany. Below, the French countryside stretched out in a patchwork of green fields and small villages, deceptively peaceful despite 4 years of occupation. The first contact came at 7:15. A flight leader spotted a German locomotive moving southeast through the Loire Valley, 12 cars of mixed cargo right on schedule. The attack was textbook. 4 Thunderbolts dove simultaneously from different angles, creating overlapping fields of fire. The lead pilot's bomb struck the locomotive squarely amidships, the massive explosion sending steam and metal fragments cascading across the tracks. The following 3 pilots strafed the length of the train, their machine guns punching through railroad car walls and igniting whatever lay inside. Within 30 minutes, reports flooded in from across the operational area. Multiple trains destroyed near Évreux. A priority ammunition convoy hit despite heavy flak near Caen. A fuel train turned into a fireball visible from 15 miles away when incendiary rounds ignited petroleum tank cars. But the German response was swift and coordinated. Railway operations centers immediately ordered all trains to seek covered positions in tunnels or marshalling yards where Allied aircraft couldn't attack effectively. Emergency protocols went into effect. Supply convoys would move only at night, using dispersed routes that avoided predictable choke points. The American pilots adapted in real time. When primary targets disappeared into protection, they found secondary targets. A locomotive hiding beneath a railway bridge near Lisieux was bypassed in favor of another train racing across open farmland 3 miles east. This train was fully exposed. 18 cars stretched behind the engine, flat cars loaded with concrete artillery emplacements, tank destroyers, and the massive steel reinforcement bars that would turn beach obstacles into killing zones. The attack run came from 12,000 feet. 4 Thunderbolts rolled into their dives, each pilot selecting his angle to ensure maximum accuracy. Altimeters unwound rapidly as the aircraft pushed past 400 miles per hour. The locomotives grew from distant specks to massive iron targets filling entire gun sites. German flak guns opened fire at 8,000 feet, sending black puffs of exploding steel into the sky. But the guns couldn't track fast enough to hit aircraft diving at such steep angles. The pilots released their bombs at 2,000 feet and felt their thunderbolts shudder as the heavy ordnance separated from wing pylons. Both 500-pound bombs from the lead aircraft struck within 10 feet of each other, penetrating the locomotive's boiler and detonating inside the firebox. The explosion was immediate and devastating. Superheated steam and metal, fragments erupted in all directions as the massive engine literally disintegrated under the force of the blast. Behind the lead aircraft, the other 3 pilots strafed the length of the train. Their .50 caliber rounds punched through armor plate and concrete alike. Tank destroyers exploded in cascades of sparks and flame. Concrete bunker sections cracked and shattered under sustained fire. Within seconds, 18 cars of irreplaceable defensive materials had been reduced to burning wreckage, scattered across a quarter-mile of French farmland. The pattern repeated across northern France throughout the morning. German supply trains that had run with impunity for years suddenly found themselves under attack from aircraft that appeared out of nowhere, struck with devastating precision, and disappeared before effective countermeasures could be organized. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By noon, the operational reports painted a picture of unprecedented success. 21 German supply trains destroyed or disabled. Over 300 railroad cars lay scattered across the French countryside. Most critically, the main supply arteries feeding German coastal defences had been severed at multiple points, creating a logistical nightmare that would take weeks to resolve. But the cost had been significant. 7 P-47s had been shot down by concentrated flak fire. 3 more limped back to base so heavily damaged they would never fly again. 2 entire flights had been jumped by German fighters over Caen, arriving sooner than expected and shooting down multiple aircraft before the Thunderbolts could climb back to fighting altitude. The surviving pilots brought back reports of increasingly sophisticated German defensive measures. Mobile flak guns that could relocate rapidly between rail lines, fighter patrols coordinated with train schedules, underground rail shelters that could protect entire convoys from air attack. The intelligence analysis that followed revealed something the planners hadn't fully anticipated. They had fundamentally changed German defensive calculations. Before April 15th, German railway operations focused on speed and efficiency. After that date, they focused on survival. Trains that once ran on predictable schedules now moved at night or in bad weather. Locomotives that once travelled main lines now took circuitous routes through secondary track. Entire marshalling yards relocated underground or into forested areas where aircraft couldn't see them. The 361st Fighter Group and other P-47 units adapted their tactics in response. Pilots learned to recognize the subtle signs of hidden trains, fresh coal smoke emerging from tree lines, the distinctive sound of locomotives in tunnels, the heat signatures of engines on infrared reconnaissance photos. They developed techniques for attacking trains in marginal visibility, using the smoke plumes as targeting references, even when the locomotives themselves were obscured. The tactical evolution became a deadly game of innovation and counter-innovation. German crews mounted flak guns directly on railroad cars, creating mobile anti-aircraft platforms that moved with the trains. American pilots responded by attacking these gun cars first, using rockets to take them out before strafing the rest of the convoy. Germans began running decoy trains filled with sandbags to draw Allied attacks away from genuine supply convoys. American intelligence learned to identify real trains by monitoring German radio traffic and observing which locomotives received fighter escorts. By June 1944, as D-Day approached, the cumulative impact of the train-busting campaign became evident in captured German documents. Supply officers reported chronic shortages of ammunition at coastal defense positions, Panzer. Units scheduled for deployment to Normandy sat immobilized due to lack of fuel. Artillery batteries received outdated shells because newer ammunition couldn't reach the front lines. Construction materials for beach obstacles arrived weeks behind schedule, leaving gaps in German defences. The strategic bombing campaign against German industry received most of the attention in post-war histories. But the tactical interdiction campaign against railways proved equally decisive in ways that were harder to quantify. A destroyed factory could be rebuilt. A blocked rail line could be cleared. But the systematic disruption of an entire transportation network created cascading failures throughout the German military supply system. The Thunderbolt's role in this campaign was unique. Unlike dedicated ground attack aircraft that operated at low altitude and slow speed, the P-47 approached targets from altitude and attacked at speeds that made interception difficult. Unlike heavy bombers, that required large formations and elaborate coordination, individual flights of 4 Thunderbolts could strike targets of opportunity without complex planning. The combination of altitude performance, diving speed, and heavy armament made the P-47 the perfect platform for a mission it was never originally designed to perform. The human cost of perfecting these tactics is visible in the casualty reports from spring 1944. Fighter pilots who had trained for aerial combat found themselves flying one of the most dangerous missions of the war, low-level attacks against heavily defended ground targets. The loss rates for ground attack sorties were significantly higher than for bomber escort missions. Pilots who survived multiple train-busting runs described the experience as more stressful than any dogfight, because evasion wasn't possible once committed to the dive. By the time Allied forces landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, the German railway system in northern France had been effectively crippled. The trains still ran, but they ran slowly, cautiously, mostly at night, and in numbers far below what German commanders needed to respond effectively to the invasion. Every hour saved by American soldiers advancing inland was purchased in part by P-47 pilots who had spent the previous months destroying locomotives one dive at a time. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of RAF Bottisham's operations centre as pilots studied reconnaissance photographs from across occupied Europe. 6 months had passed since that first devastating day in April, and the images told a story of systematic destruction that had fundamentally altered the German war machine. Rail yards that once bustled with continuous traffic now sat eerily quiet, their twisted metal skeletons testament to hundreds of P-47 attack runs. The numbers were staggering even by wartime standards. Between D-Day and the end of summer 1944, Thunderbolt pilots had destroyed or damaged thousands of locomotives and tens of thousands of railroad cars across France, Belgium, and Western Germany. The tactical evolution had been remarkable. What began as improvised dive bombing techniques had developed into sophisticated multi-squadron operations involving precise coordination between fighter groups, reconnaissance aircraft, and intelligence networks. Pilots now trained on detailed scale models of German locomotives, learning to identify vulnerable components that could disable an entire train with minimal ammunition expenditure. The strategic implications were profound. Allied tank divisions pushing across France encountered German positions that were chronically short of ammunition and fuel, a direct result of the rail interdiction campaign that had severed supply lines throughout the critical summer. Panzer units that should have been equipped with the latest anti-tank rounds were fighting with outdated ammunition. Artillery batteries were rationing shells that would normally be fired in sustained barrages. Intelligence reports painted a picture of German desperation. Railway workers were requesting transfers away from supply routes. Train crews were refusing to operate during daylight hours. The psychological impact on German logistics personnel was becoming evident in intercepted communications. The mere presence of clear skies meant P-47s would be hunting, and no locomotive was safe. German transportation officers had resorted to increasingly elaborate deception measures. Dummy trains filled with sandbags drew Allied attacks away from genuine supply convoys. Decoy locomotives emitted smoke plumes to confuse targeting. Complex routing schedules changed daily to avoid predictable patterns. Yet the Thunderbolt squadrons continued to find and destroy their targets, adapting faster than German countermeasures could evolve. By September 1944, German rail traffic had dropped 70% from pre-invasion levels. They were moving everything by road convoy now, which meant slower transport times and higher fuel consumption, fuel they increasingly didn't have. The interdiction campaign had forced Germany into exactly the situation Allied planners hoped for: supply bottlenecks that couldn't keep pace with frontline demands. The cost of this success weighed heavily on every squadron. The walls of operations centers displayed photographs of pilots who hadn't returned from train-busting missions. Men who had pushed their luck once too often against increasingly sophisticated German defenses. The loss rate for ground attack sorties remained significantly higher than for bomber escort missions throughout the campaign. German anti-aircraft units had adapted with deadly efficiency. Mobile flak guns deployed along predicted flight paths. Coordinated fighter intercepts caught diving P-47s at their most vulnerable moments. Heavy weapons. Missions continued whenever weather allowed, because every train that reached the front lines extended the war. December 1944 brought new challenges when Germany launched its Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. The German High Command had planned the attack for winter specifically to neutralize Allied air superiority. Though weather did constrain operations, American pilots flew whenever possible, and P-47s proved crucial in interdicting German supply lines during the desperate fighting. The final months of the war saw the train-busting campaign reach its culmination. As Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, P-47 squadrons shifted from attacking supply trains in occupied territory to hitting them in the German heartland. The missions grew more dangerous as German air defenses concentrated around remaining industrial areas, but the strategic impact grew proportionally greater as each destroyed locomotive represented supplies that could never be replaced. By April 1945, German rail traffic for the entire Western Front had dropped to a fraction of wartime requirements. The supply crisis had become so acute that German commanders reported ammunition shortages preventing sustained artillery barrages, fuel shortages grounding Luftwaffe squadrons, and replacement equipment shortages leaving entire divisions under strength. The official statistics compiled after the war tell part of the story. From D-Day until VE Day, Thunderbolt pilots claimed to have destroyed 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. The actual numbers were likely lower. Combat claims always exceeded confirmed kills, but even conservative estimates suggested the P-47's ground attack campaign had destroyed more German military equipment than any other Allied aircraft type. But numbers couldn't capture the human dimension of what had been accomplished. Every destroyed locomotive represented a tactical innovation mastered under fire. Every successful mission reflected split-second decisions made while diving at terminal velocity toward heavily defended targets. Every pilot who completed a tour of train-busting sorties had survived odds that claimed roughly 1 in 20 aircraft on ground attack missions. The broader military community took notice. The tactical manual developed from Thunderbolt train-busting operations became required reading at Air Force schools worldwide. The dive bombing techniques pioneered over France influenced ground attack doctrine for decades. Korean War pilots flying 51 Mustangs used modified versions of these tactics against North Korean supply trains. Vietnam-era Aoni Sky Raiders adopted similar low-level attack procedures for interdiction missions. The fundamental lesson transcended specific aircraft or missions. The P-47 rail interdiction campaign demonstrated that tactical audacity could overcome apparently insurmountable challenges. Faced with German supply lines that seemed invulnerable to conventional attack, pilots had developed entirely new tactical approaches that achieved strategic objectives thought impossible. German archives captured after the war revealed the full impact of the campaign from the enemy perspective. Transportation Command reports documented the panic that seized German logistics officers as train after train disappeared from schedules. By July 1944, German supply convoys were taking twice as long to reach frontline positions due to forced reliance on road transport. The cumulative effect was a German army increasingly unable to respond effectively to Allied advances. Technical innovations developed for train busting influenced fighter design for years afterward. Improved bomb sights, upgraded armament configurations, enhanced radio communications all became standard features on subsequent aircraft. The tactics manual that emerged from operations established principles of precision ground attack that remained relevant through the jet age. Perhaps most significantly, the campaign demonstrated the decisive importance of supply line warfare in modern conflicts. German forces that had conquered most of Europe were ultimately defeated not solely by superior firepower or larger armies, but by their inability to maintain the logistical flow that kept military units operational. Every destroyed locomotive represented thousands of artillery rounds that never reached German gun positions, hundreds of tons of fuel that never powered German vehicles, and countless replacement parts that never repaired damaged equipment. The human stories behind the statistics remained vivid decades later. Pilots who survived the war carried memories of diving through flak at 400 miles per hour, of locomotives exploding in massive fireballs, of pulling 6Gs during pullouts that left vision tunneled and hearing muted. They remembered wingmen who didn't come back, aircraft that returned so shot up they were scrapped, and the constant tension of knowing that every mission might be the last. The German perspective became available through post-war interviews with surviving transportation officers. Train crews described the terror of hearing the distinctive buzzsaw shriek of diving Thunderbolts, knowing they had perhaps 20 seconds before bombs and machine gun fire turned their locomotive into scrap metal. Railway workers recounted sabotaging their own equipment rather than risk operating trains that had become magnets for Allied airstrikes. The tactical legacy extended far beyond World War II. Modern close air support doctrine traces its lineage directly to the techniques developed by P-47 pilots over occupied Europe. The concept of using fast, heavily armed aircraft to attack time-sensitive ground targets became a cornerstone of American military doctrine. The F-16, Aten, and other ground attack aircraft of later generations all inherited lessons learned when Thunderbolt pilots first proved that fighters could destroy trains. Yet the broader lesson remained relevant across all military operations. Innovation matters more than resources. The P-47 wasn't designed for train busting. The tactics weren't in any manual. The techniques were developed through trial and error by pilots willing to try something unconventional. Their success demonstrated that creative thinking applied to operational problems could accomplish more than massive resources used through traditional methods. As the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the train-busting campaign concluded with the complete collapse of German rail transport capacity. Across the entire Western Front, German forces were receiving less than 10% of required supply allocations. The systematic destruction of locomotives and railroad infrastructure had created cascading 80s, failures throughout the German military supply system that proved impossible to overcome. The final mission reports documented what pilots had achieved. Starting with experimental attacks in spring 1944, they had paralyzed the transportation network that sustained Hitler's war machine. Their tactical innovation had shortened the war, saving countless lives on both sides. More fundamentally, they had proven that audacity and precision could triumph over conventional wisdom. 27 years after the war's end, veterans of the campaign gathered for reunions, where they shared stories that had shaped military aviation doctrine. The P-47's reputation as a train killer had become part of aviation legend. But the real legacy lay in demonstrating that sometimes the most unconventional ideas produce the most decisive results. The Thunderbolt, that was supposedly too heavy and slow for ground attack, had destroyed more locomotives than any other aircraft in history. The tactics that violated every principle in the manual had crippled an entire enemy transportation system. The pilots who were told to stick to bomber escort had instead revolutionized close air support warfare. The photographs hanging in museums showed massive aircraft with radial engines and 8 machine guns. But the story behind those photos was about human innovation under pressure, about pilots who saw a problem conventional methods couldn't solve, and created a solution that changed warfare itself. The trains that once carried German armies across Europe had met their match in the form of 7-ton fighters diving out of the sky at 400 miles per hour. What had seemed impossible in January 1944 had become routine by June. What military doctrine said couldn't work had worked decisively enough to help win a war. The legacy of that achievement lives on, not just in aviation museums or history books, but in the fundamental understanding that creative solutions to tactical problems can have strategic consequences. The P-47 pilots who hunted trains over occupied France didn't just destroy locomotives. They proved that innovation, courage, and precision could accomplish what conventional approaches could not. In the end, the slow fighter that wasn't supposed to be able to attack ground targets had destroyed 9,000 locomotives and helped bring down the Third Reich. Sometimes the craziest ideas really are the ones that work. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.